You reach for the light switch without thinking. The room floods with light. The shadows disappear instantly and you move on with your night. But your ancestors never had that option. For nearly 200,000 years, when the sun went down, the world simply vanished. And the truth about what filled that darkness for them is far stranger than a simple fear of the unknown. Think about the last time you walked through a dark room in your own house. Your heart rate ticked up. Your steps slowed. Some old circuit in your brain quietly switched on, scanning for shapes that shouldn't be there. You knew logically that nothing was waiting for you. But your body didn't believe you. That gap between what you know and what you feel is not a flaw. It's a fossil psychologist Arne Ullman spent decades studying why certain fears form almost instantly while others take real effort to learn. He found that humans are neurologically primed to fear specific ancient threats faster than modern ones. Snakes, spiders, and critically, darkness itself, because darkness is where those threats used to hide. Ullman called this evolutionary preparedness. Your brain isn't randomly anxious in the dark. It's running a very old, very specific threat detection program. Here's what that program was built for. For most of human history, night was not a peaceful time to unwind. It was the most dangerous stretch of every 24 hours. Large predators with far better night vision than humans did their hunting after dusk. Lions, hyenas, leopards. Early hominins had poor night vision, no claws, no natural weapons, and a body built for daytime endurance, not nighttime combat. When the light disappeared, your ancestors lost their single greatest advantage, the ability to see danger coming. So what did they actually fear? Not ghosts, not monsters. Not yet anyway. The earliest fear of darkness was almost certainly a fear of predation, plain and mechanical. A rustle in the grass. A pair of eyes catching a sliver of moonlight. The specific, animal terror of not knowing what's 5 feet away when your best sense, vision, has just been switched off. Evolutionary psychiatrist Randolph Nesse has a theory that explains why this fear didn't fade even after humans built fires, walls, and cities. He calls it the smoke detector principle. A smoke detector that never misses a real fire will also go off constantly for burnt toast. Evolution doesn't build perfectly calibrated fear. It builds fear that's cheap to trigger and expensive to ignore. A false alarm costs you a moment of adrenaline. A missed real threat costs you your life. So natural selection kept the sensitive alarm running long after actual predators stopped waiting in the dark outside your bedroom. That's why the fear outlived the danger. You don't live anywhere near a leopard. Your house has locks, walls, and a roof. And yet the moment the lights go out, some part of your nervous system still runs the ancient calculation. Is something out there? Can I see it? Can it see me? Your rational brain knows the answer is no. Your older, faster brain isn't so sure. Which one do you think is actually in charge when you're standing at the top of a dark staircase? This is where the story gets stranger, though, because fear of the dark didn't stay purely instinctual for long. Once early humans developed language, something happened that no other species has ever done with fear. They started narrating it. Instead of just reacting to danger, they began explaining it, warning each other about it, and eventually turning it into stories. Researcher Daniel Kruger, who studies environmental psychology and perceived vulnerability, has found something that connects directly back to this ancient pattern. In his research on how people judge dangerous versus safe environments, darkness consistently ranks as one of the strongest predictors of felt vulnerability, regardless of actual crime statistics or real risk in that location. In other words, a well-lit, statistically dangerous street can feel safer than a poorly lit, statistically safe one. Your gut isn't calculating real-world data. It's still running the old rule: if I can't see, I can't protect myself. Now layer human storytelling on top of that raw instinct, and you get something new. Predators in the dark stopped being just physical animals. They became symbolic ones. Nearly every early human culture, separated by oceans and thousands of years with no contact between them, independently created stories about dangerous things that come out at night. Spirits, demons, creatures that hunt in darkness and vanish in daylight. That is not a coincidence. That is a real biological fear being translated into myth. Generation after generation, because myth was the technology early humans had for transmitting survival. Information before writing existed. A story that says, "Don't go into the dark forest alone," is really just an ancient warning system wearing a costume. The version with monsters was more memorable, more emotionally charged, and far more likely to be repeated around the fire and passed down to children. Fear that gets turned into story survives longer than fear that stays as pure instinct. So the myths didn't replace the biological fear. They preserved it, encoded it, and handed it forward. Look at how consistently this shows up across cultures that never once made contact with each other. West African oral traditions warn of spirits that only move after sunset. Norse folklore is filled with creatures that hunt in the black winter nights. Japanese yokai famously prowl the hours between dusk and dawn. Mesoamerican mythology describes gods and monsters tied directly to darkness and the underworld. These groups had no shared language, no shared geography, and thousands of years of separation. What they shared instead was a nervous system built by the same evolutionary pressures, reacting to the same absence of light in remarkably similar ways. When completely unconnected cultures independently arrive at the same fear wearing only slightly different masks, that's not superstition repeating itself by accident. That's biology, expressing itself through story. And there's a practical reason these particular stories worked so well as survival tools. A child who is simply told predators are more active at night might forget that instruction by the following week. A child who is told a vivid, frightening story about a creature waiting in the dark remembers it for the rest of their life and tells it to their own children without needing to be asked. Fear wrapped in narrative is fear that self-replicates. It doesn't need constant reinforcement from a parent standing over you explaining statistics. It only needs to be told once, well, at the right age, in the right tone, by firelight. Firelight itself deserves a closer look here because it wasn't just a source of warmth. The control of fire was arguably one of the most significant turning points in the story of the fear of darkness. For the first time, humans could push back the edge of night by a few meters. They could see each other's faces after sunset. They could keep watch collectively, take turns sleeping, and reduce the odds that anything could approach unseen. Anthropologists studying the social role of fire in early hunter-gatherer groups have noted that nighttime firelight gatherings likely became one of the earliest consistent settings for storytelling, bonding, and the transmission of exactly these kinds of cautionary tales. The fire didn't eliminate the fear of the dark. It created a small, defended island inside it, and that island became the birthplace of a huge amount of human culture. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. That transmission never stopped. You were handed the same fear, just wearing a modern costume. You didn't grow up worried about leopards, but you probably grew up scared of what might be under the bed, or in the closet, or standing just outside your peripheral vision in a dark hallway. Nobody had to convince you that darkness was dangerous. You arrived preloaded with the suspicion. Culture simply filled in the specific shape of the monster. Consider what actually happens in your body the next time you're alone in an unfamiliar dark space. Your pupils dilate, trying to gather every scrap of available light. Your hearing sharpens, tuning into frequencies it normally ignores. Your muscles tense, ready to run or fight even though you have no idea what you'd be running from. This is not an overreaction. This is a 200,000-year-old survival protocol executing exactly as designed, in a world that no longer needs it nearly as often. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the fear of darkness kept your ancestors alive long enough to have children, and their children long enough to have you, then in a very real sense, that fear is one of the reasons you exist at all. Every ancestor who calmly wandered into pitch-black terrain without a shred of caution had a shorter life expectancy and fewer descendants than the ones who felt that prickling unease and turned back. You are, quite literally, descended from the anxious ones, the cautious ones, the ones who listened to the fear instead of dismissing it. That reframes the whole feeling, doesn't it? What feels like an embarrassing overreaction, jumping at a shadow, refusing to turn off every light before bed, checking a dark room twice, is actually a direct inheritance from the humans who were careful enough to survive. You're not broken for feeling uneasy in the dark. You're running inherited software from ancestors who needed exactly that unease to make it to morning. Modern life has mostly solved the actual problem. Streetlights, indoor lighting, locked doors, and the near-total absence of large predators in most human environments mean the original threat has essentially disappeared. But the alarm system that evolved to detect that threat is still fully installed, still wired in, still switching on the instant the lights go off. You can't simply switch it off through logic because it was never built to respond to logic. It was built to respond to darkness itself. Notice how much of modern life is quietly organized around soothing this exact ancient circuit, even when nobody names it that way. Hallway nightlights in children's bedrooms, motion sensor porch lamps that snap on the instant something moves near your house, the specific relief of pulling into a well-lit driveway after a long drive compared to the tension of pulling into a dark one. Entire industries, home security systems, streetlight infrastructure, phone flashlights exist in part to manage a fear that technically stopped being necessary for survival tens of thousands of years ago. You are still building small fires. They just look like light bulbs now. Even the horror genre, one of the most consistently profitable forms of entertainment in human history, runs almost entirely on this same old circuitry. Strip away the specific monster, the ghost, the killer, the creature, and nearly every horror film relies on the same underlying mechanic your ancestors knew intimately. Reduce visibility. Remove the character's ability to see the threat clearly, and their fear response spikes automatically. Filmmakers don't need to explain why a dark basement is scarier than a sunlit kitchen. Audiences already know instinctively, without being told, because that knowledge was never really about basements at all. It was about the 200,000 years before basements existed. So the next time you feel that familiar unease flick on in a dark room, notice it for what it actually is. Not a personal weakness. Not an irrational glitch. A message, forwarded to you across thousands of generations, from ancestors who survived the night by taking that exact feeling seriously. You reach for the light switch without thinking. But somewhere underneath that simple modern motion, a much older hand is reaching too, and it has been reaching for 200,000 years.